here, back again. Haven't been around a while, just into the school year, a lot of stuff going on. But today, free from the school year, finally back again, ready to talk about new information, new resources. I didn't finish Art Fundamentals yet in terms of the videos, but I figured what I really wanted to do was kind of get into the new stuff. And so here we are. We're going to get into social science now. This isn't going to be the typical format. Usually I'm going to be typing as I go, but I thought I had recorded this earlier. Turns out I had pressed the wrong button and it did not record, but that's okay. We're going to go ahead and kind of just talk through these things here. And then eventually, once this is done, I will be making this Word document available. It's kind of like a power guide, right? It's hopefully a cheaper power guide. I'll be making this available on my Teachers Pay Teachers page. I've already put up a social science section 1 Quizlet or Excel spreadsheet that can be pretty easily turned into a Quizlet with questions and answers. That's about 900 questions long or so. But yeah, I like starting with SoSci as the kind of thing to do because it typically really is the central theme of everything. For example, right, the 1960s it explained, SoSci explained why the 60s were the theme, and then music and art and literature and economics really kind of revolved around that. Same thing last year, what was the topic last year? I can't believe I'm blanking on it. I read it so many times. The kind of health stuff, right? The history of healthcare. I'm going to go through this, and today we're going to go through the clashing ideals subsection. I'm probably going to try to break them out like that into the italicized subsections, right? And so this first section is called From Allies to Rivals, World War II ends and the Cold War begins. So with the origins of the Cold War, they tend to believe that the Cold War officially began in 1946. They're also going to bring up so they say how this is when Soviet and American leaders publicly spoke of the divide between the two countries. They also will bring up later Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain speech, which is occurred, I believe, in Fulton, Missouri. They'll also kind of signify that as one of the major times that scholars consider to be the beginning of the Cold War. But post-World War II, we see the national interests of the Americans and the Soviets become irreparable, right? They're irreconcilable. And what we see is that each has they feel like they have this mandate to make the world out into their own image. We also see these divergent interests set them on the collision course. So the original interests that they have, right, spreading their culture, their political ideology, and then also like their very short-term goals set them all along these divergent paths. But then on top of that, the ideological divide between them really accelerates that forward, right, as they try to race each other. It keeps that momentum going up until the end of the Cold War in around 1989, 1990. So this section is clashing ideals. So really this is just kind of setting the tone for what's different between the two. Very quickly, the United States believes in individual liberty and free market capitalism with an asterisk because it's not totally free market. There is a lot of government intervention in the United States capitalist economy. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, believes in Marxist-Leninist revolution, which we'll talk about what that means here a little bit later, and centralized economic planning, right? So coming from the government as opposed to free market capitalism. So these are very stark differences, right? They are very, very different societies. However, there are a lot of similarities, right? So first off, they both promote universal models that the rest of the world should imitate, believing that there's a superior. They trace their beginnings all the way to these idealistic revolutions. The American Revolution, you know a lot about. The Russian Revolution, we'll go into some detail in, not as much, frankly, as I think they should have, but they got to cut. They got to create a decently sized resource, which this resource isn't too long. It's long, but it could have been much longer. And then they both envisioned the founders envisioned each of these countries as this massive experiment. And as we're going to see later, both of them really departed from previous Eurocentric and European-based ideals. And they both believed that humankind's future depended upon their success. And this was talked about by Odd Arne Westad, who is a historian. So make sure you know him. There's a couple of historians we'll talk about. You got to make sure that you know them just in case. In the Cold War, CW stemmed from a clash between their visions from the world, but they were both alike in their ambition to push their visions upon the world. And the leaders, of course, each sincerely believed in their moral supremacy, and with that moral supremacy, they expand their system with missionary zeal, which really is a good analogy, because the missionaries, especially the early missionaries into the Americas from Europe, they believed their system was superior, right, to the indigenous religions, and so they really wanted to spread it, not in any sense of, maybe a sense of moral superiority. Moral superiority is true, but also, like, they believed that they were saving those people, right, by giving them those systems. And that's what we're seeing with both the United States and the Soviet Union. They believed they were saving these countries by promoting their systems. So let's start with the American ideals. Wilsonian democracy and American exceptionalism. So, with the charismatic leadership of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was shortened to FDR, U.S. was able to shed popular isolationist tendencies of the 1930s. So, after World War I, and especially after the Great Depression, the United States became incredibly isolationist, in particular economically. With the Great Depression hit, we had a thing called the Smoot-Hawley tariff, where basically we shut our borders to foreign trade, which in retrospect is the exact opposite that they should have done. But nevertheless, we saw a very strong isolationist ideal in the United States, and political ideal that was very popular. But with FDR, we see an internationalist foreign policy that they characterize as muscular, meaning very strong, right? Very trying to push their ideas onto other people by the end of World War II. And so before entering the war, we see FDR created a very powerful wartime narrative before they even joined it, because we see that, what the biggest point of the isolationists is that any war in Europe is not our war, right? It doesn't involve us. We shouldn't get involved, right? It just it kills Americans, right? FDR argues, actually, no, that's not true. It's a war against the very core of American ideals, against freedom and liberty and self-determination. He delivered this speech in early 1941. They weren't very clear if it was this speech or a different speech that they were talking about. I'm going to go ahead and assume the speech we're talking about here, but in early 1941, which is a year before America joins the war, because the Pearl Harbor happens late 1941. They finally enter the war, or start participating in the war in 1942. And he's echoing the rhetoric of Woodrow Wilson, who he had served in his administration previously in the late 1910s. I'm not sure if the four freedoms are from Wilson, or they're particularly uniquely an FDR idea. But he identifies four freedoms: the freedom of speech, the freedom of worship, the freedom from fear, and the freedom from want. Let's see if I still have that up somewhere. And here we will see from Norman Rockwell, which I'll come back to this in a bit. But Norman Rockwell will visualize these freedoms for FDR. So a little bit later that year, August 1941, so the war has started, World War II has started, but the U.S. is not joined. We're kind of at the point, I think, where Britain is being invaded or bombed by the Germans. Roosevelt issues a joint declaration with Winston Churchill, who is the British Prime Minister, and that joint declaration is called the Atlantic Charter. And the Atlantic Charter outlines a set of shared principles, namely free trade, national self-determination, and democracy. But from the get-go, the Atlantic Charter is full of hypocritical ideas, because Britain, so self-determination, the idea of self-determination is that each nation, each cultural ethnic group should be able to determine their own political organization. At the same time, Britain still had a very large empire, especially in Africa and in India. And so Britain, despite signing the Atlantic Charter, wanted to keep their empire together. They won't, but they were pretty keen on preserving it at this point. At the end of World War II, after World War II, they're going to pretty much be okay with getting rid of their imperial ambitions. France not as much, and we'll talk about that when we get to Vietnam. But the Atlantic Charter draws directly from Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, which he originally created in an address to Congress in 1918. And then in 1919, he presented it to the world at the Versailles Peace Conference. And it promoted a lot of things, roughly about 14 of them. But the two things that we want to focus on are the national self-determination and international cooperation, which leads to the creation of the League of Nations. There's a lot of other stuff in there. Ironically, above all, the United States does not support the 14 points that the United States president created. Congress does not pass it. Does not pass the introduction of the League of Nations. So there you go. And so after the United States enters World War II, we see Saturday Evening Post illustrator Norman Rockwell depict FDR's four freedoms, which we saw here. We have the freedom of speech, which is available in the resource. We have the freedom of worship. And then, so, this freedom of worship one is interesting. Just kind of looking at it, I don't necessarily see anybody that's not Catholic or Christian, I should say. You can't really tell per se, and I think that's maybe the point, but there is some clear Christian iconography with the rosary bead here. Everybody else is just kind of praying. I can't tell what book this is, if it's a Bible or a Torah or something like that. But this seems to be very, a Christian-focused image, which is ironic in the sense of freedom of worship. And then we have these two down here. We have freedom from fear, right? And then freedom from want, right? So this one's very popular, very, very popular picture. But yeah, those are so. And Rockwell made these not because he's just oh hey I'm going to make these because it seems like a good idea. He made it to advertise war bonds, which war bonds were when you give the government money right now to help fund the war, and then in exchange later on you will get your money back from the government with interest. Not a lot of interest, but interest. And these help provide powerful images to remind Americans what they were fighting for and against. And then FDR starts to draft a post-war blueprint for the world based on American principles of self-determination, of equality, of liberty, right, stuff like that, which really draws an eye to the wartime alliance have with the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union has very different ideals and principles from the United States. Speaking of this U.S.-Soviet alliance, it is not an alliance that was made happily. It's a marriage of convenience. And in fact, the Soviets were originally allied with Hitler until Hitler, of course, betrayed them and invaded them after defeating the Western Front of France. So this U.S.-Soviet alliance is not based on shared ideals, but instead on the overlapping interests. And that overlapping interest is their common foe, which is defeating Hitler. And that task of defeating Hitler was so gargantuan and so important that it obscured any of the differences between them. And so we see at the same time, World War II, really, especially because of Hitler, creates this situation where Americans start to see the world as either good or bad, black or white, right? Free or not free, as opposed to shades of gray, which maybe if the United States did see the world in shades of gray, maybe the Cold War isn't as intense as it was. But we see that Roosevelt's War Department also sponsors propaganda that reinforced the Allies were fighting a just war. And in particular, one piece of propaganda they bring up is the movie Why We Fight by Frank Capra, which opens with a quote from the Vice President, Henry Wallace, which is wild to think about, where he says, "This is a fight between a free world and a slave world." And you see two globes come up at the same time, one bathed in light, one in darkness, to kind of go along with the quote. So, again, the propaganda really solidifying in American minds that this is good versus evil, and then they're going to expand that into the Cold War. Excuse me. And then their victory solidified it as a good war, right? That they won because they were in the moral right. And after defeating Hitler, right, after defeating this very immoral person and this very immoral regime, right, they start to see America as this place of moral righteousness. And that leads into the idea of American exceptionalism, which really takes hold after World War II. American exceptionalism being the idea that the U.S. possessed a unique historical duty to spread its values and institutions. And And because of American exceptionalism, and combined with the idea that them and the Soviet Union were ideologically opposite, that led to an almost inevitable clash between the two. And this American exceptionalism is not new. It is a fact made before the United States was even a country. Started in 1630 in a speech by the Puritan minister / the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, John Winthrop, who urged his parishioners, his Puritan parishioners, to make their colony a city upon a hill, right, a beacon upon a hill for the rest of the world to see, inspire others while pleasing God, right? And this idea of the city upon a hill resonates with the founding fathers and later generations. Lincoln himself will refer to John Winthrop quite a bit as well. And so this made American exceptionalism, right, had made Americans believe that they had a divine mandate, a God-given mandate to do two things, which is defend freedom and spread democracy around the world. And then we see a editorial written by publisher Henry Luce really captures the resonance of American exceptionalism at the time. He wrote this editorial in early 1941, so this is around the same time FDR makes his speech at the Four Freedoms, where he starts to say, it's our time to spread the ideals of our civilization on the whole. And he called on Americans to pool their individual efforts to create what he called the first great American century, making this, the 20th century, the century of American leadership. And he places American leadership at the center of national affairs and champions America as a beacon of freedom and liberty for the rest of the world. So for some context here, in the 19th century, America was certainly growing and certainly becoming more powerful, but the 19th century still really belonged to the European nations, specifically Britain, and to a lesser extent France, and later on Germany, right? France maybe earlier 19th century, but after their lots of revolutions, right, they really kind of fall out of it. And then Germany, especially once they unify in the 1860s and 1870s and start to rapidly industrialize under Otto von Bismarck. The United States was kind of second to both of them, right? They weren't super powerful. In fact, the United States wasn't considered a power really until World War I. When they entered World War I, they were able to outproduce everybody in Europe, right, creating this massive military economy, right? And in fact, even after World War I and before World War II, right, even without the Great Depression, the American economy wasn't per se like this incredible thing, right? It was strong, but it wasn't that strong. And so with World War II, with the opportunities presented here, right, to create this American century in the second half of the 19th century or 20th century, excuse me, right, that's going to be an idea that strongly resonates with Americans who believe their country is exceptional, who believe their country has this divine mandate, right? So that's going to be very, very important for Americans. Now, for the Soviets, let's talk about the Soviet ideals: Marxist, Leninist, revolution, and Stalinism. So the Soviet Union was born from a very, very chaotic time. Frankly, Russia had been in chaos since the beginning of the 1900s, almost right around 1905, really, you would probably want to say, where the Winter Palace Massacre occurs, where lots of people were protesting at the winter vacation palace of the Tsar at the time, Tsar Nicholas. They were protesting there, and then there was a massive riot that broke out, and then that riot was then challenged with gunfire from the guards of the Winter Palace, and so that led to a lot of issues. On top of that, they lost the war to Japan. They were the first European nation to lose a war to a non-European nation, basically in the era of gunpowder. So that was very embarrassing. And so that all led up into World War I. In World War I, the Russians are frankly getting their butts kicked. They are not doing very well in the war. And then the push to get out of the war becomes so strong that the Russian Empire basically falls under that pressure, right? So they talked about the Russian Empire being weakened by 3 years of war. Again, it's World War I. They are completely decimated by it. And internal divisions. And those internal divisions not only include the communists, but also include lots of groups of people who just want to get out of the war. And so once that happens, so 1917, right, the empire completely disintegrates, and we get two revolutions. We get the revolution kind of the bourgeoisie, right? The provisional government comes in, The provisional government could have been the permanent government if they did what the people asked. And what the people asked most of all was to get out of the war. But the provisional government said, hey, we're not permanent. We're this temporary government. We can't make that call. And so then just like half a year later, right, in the same year, we see the revolutions occur again, right? I believe 1917, right? We see another set of revolutions, or another revolution occur, which brings the communists to power. So we see two revolutions. We see a brutal civil war in the early 1920s, 1920 and 1922, somewhere around that, where you see the communist Bolsheviks, we'll talk about in a second, but the communist Bolsheviks are in charge, known as the Reds. They will fight the loyalists to the Tsar, known as the Whites, which also included American soldiers. The United States will send soldiers over in an attempt to kind of halt the spread of communism. That fails. The Red Army emerges victorious, and the group known as the Bolsheviks take power. So who are the Bolsheviks? So the Communist Party in Russia was broken up into two main groups. You have the Bolsheviks, who are the more extreme part of the Marxist Communist political party in Russia. And then you have the Mensheviks, who are the more moderate part of the Marxist Revolutionary Political Party. And so basically, after some internal struggles, the Bolsheviks will take power, and they, again, emerge victorious in the Civil War and create the world's first socialist state in 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, of course known as the USSR. The first leader of the USSR is Vladimir Lenin. Vladimir Lenin helps create an entirely new society, and so they compared the American Revolution and the Russian Revolution to each other earlier. It was probably not the most identical revolution. In the American Revolution, they were changing their political system, right? They were trying to get rid of the British and create American self-rule, but they really kept a lot of the same social structures around. But the Russian Revolution completely changed their social structure as well, right? It got rid of the nobility, it got rid of the peasantry, right? It made everybody equal. So this is actually probably more equivalent to the French Revolution of 1789. The French Revolution was not only about a massive political change, right, moving from a pure monarchy and absolute monarchy to a constitutional monarchy that had a monarch and a parliament. And then eventually, once the king tried to kind of escape Paris, they didn't trust him anymore. And so then they tried to make it a full-blown republic. And of course, ends with Napoleon, right? But not only were they making a political change, they were also completely warping and changing their social structure for centuries, if not millennium. The social structure of France had been the priests in the first estate, the clergy, the nobles in the second estate, and then everybody else in what's called the third estate. And they wanted to get rid of that, right? They confiscated church land. They confiscated the land of the nobility. They tried to redistribute that to people, right? They tried to create a much more equal society, right? Not a communist society, but certainly a society where the haves versus the have-nots was not as bad. And that's what's happening here in Russia, in the Soviet Union, right? Their goal is to not only create a new political system, right, one-party rule, but also create a new society where there are no social hierarchies based on race, class, or gender, right? Create this new egalitarian society. And this goes all the way back to the philosophy of the 19th century German intellectual Karl Marx. He is the founder of communism, him along with his friend Friedrich Engels. He was the author. They were the author of the Communist Manifesto, which the manifesto kind of outlines like what should happen, like the two revolutions and stuff like that, to create communism. But the key thing that Karl Marx did is he viewed history as the history of man as a history of class struggle. That throughout throughout civilization, right, the ultimate struggle in society is between those who have wealth, who have power, and those who do not have wealth or have power. And so the only way to end this cycle, according to Marx, was for the proletarian, the commoners, right, the peasants. The proletarians needed to rise up and overthrow the ruling class. And he wrote this in the context of the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, where the division between the business owners and the manager class, right, that kind of that upper class and that middle class was more starkly represented than ever before, because everybody lived in these urban areas, and you can very clearly see the difference just from neighborhood to neighborhood between the wealthy and the not wealthy, right? And that anything that the not wealthy tried to do to get more power, to get more help, just didn't really happen a lot of times, right? And so he believed that you need to you're not overthrowing the political system, you're overthrowing the social structure, right? You're overthrowing those wealthy people who have control, right? And so Lenin takes those ideas and adapts them to Russia's particular differences, right? Marx being a German, right? He was probably mostly focused on Germany and actually England. He also lived in England for a little bit. So Lenin takes those ideas and forges a coalition of intellectuals, of soldiers, of workers, and peasants, right? And looks onto what Russia needs, what the Soviet Union needs to do right now, right? And kind of creates a twist on Marxist communism. Lenin himself was an outspoken champion of not just revolution in the Soviet Union, but world revolution. He wanted to create, right, communist revolution throughout the world. And we especially see the Marxist-Leninist critique of capitalism and of economic inequality really strongly supported in the colonial world. These colonial subjects had been suppressed, had been underrepresented, not represented at all. Excuse me, I'll get some water. They had not been represented at all in these political systems. And on top of that, with the role of the Enlightenment, Enlightenment, of course, creating this idea of political and social equality for all, right? And that idea coming out of Europe, but then at the same time, those Europeans not allowing their own subjects to participate in that equality led to a lot of anger in the colonial world, especially because a lot of the colonial subjects were educated in these European states that were talking about Enlightenment, right? That were talking about equality, right? And so for them to not get that same representation was very hypocritical and angered the colonial subjects. And so when Lenin over here is talking about, hey, class struggle is the thing, let's rise up and, get our own and form a more equal society, those colonies really listened. And so we see Soviet domestic and foreign policies align with an official ideology known as Marxist-Leninism. They said Marxism-Leninism in the resource, but it's Marxism and it's Leninism. But when you put them together, it's Marxist-Leninism, right? So the key to Marxist-Leninism, right? So Marx didn't necessarily lay out these centralized economic ideals, right? But we have a centralized economy with production goals set by the state, what are called 5-year plans. The first 5-year plans really focusing on industrialization in Russia, which is in the Soviet Union, which is kind of when we talk about the unique problems for the Soviet Union. What we're really talking about is their lack of industrialization, right? And so they're going to try to rapidly catch up in that, and for the most part, they will. And then later on, they're going to collectivize agriculture, which is bad. They probably shouldn't have done that, but that's part of socialism, right? Is the collectivization of goods and services and production, right? They create a lot of social welfare programs as well. I don't know if we would call the next part below it the social welfare programs, or they just said, hey, there's social welfare programs, but we're not going to talk about them. But they also open educational and professional opportunities to workers, to women, and to ethnic minorities, which the Soviet Union has a lot of ethnic minorities, lots and lots and lots of different cultural groups living within the Russian Empire, within the Soviet Union. And in fact, that anti-racist stance on the Soviet Union gives them a very good reputation within the African American community, who have been facing, systemic racism for never, right, within the United States. And in fact, it's going to be one of the big ideological legs of the Soviet Union against the United States, is that the Soviet Union treats everybody equally, right? The United States does not, right? Even though they preach this idealistic ideas of equality and self-rule, that's not even happening within their own country, right? Look at the roles of African Americans and other ethnic minorities within the United States, right? That's going to be one of their big arguments that they have a leg to stand on, right? And so by the 1930s, Soviet Union and the capital Moscow was very much admired by leftists around the globe because of their rapid industrialization, because of their ambitious social policies and the fact that they were the first to do it, what they called their ideological clout, right? And so we see the Soviet people also really embrace this idea of them being themselves being this beacon because of Soviet education, right? This open education system where people are getting their first opportunity to get education, and so they're getting that from the communists, so that's going to be favorable to people, but also B, they are learning about communism and their policies and ideology within these schools, right? So those things combined made Soviet education very powerful in terms of influencing the people of the Soviet Union to believe their goals are just and good and noble. And on top of that, the Soviet Union mastered propaganda, at least at home, right? They really made people feel like they were part of a big project, and they needed to play their role. Within foreign policy, Marxist-Leninism had a very interesting framework. They said rigid, right? Very solidly, like, these are the rules. This is what you do. But at the same time, you could possibly maneuver within those and being pragmatic and being realistic, right? And the main thing about the foreign policy is that it's the relationship with capitalism. Now, their belief is capitalism is inherently exploitative and hostile towards communism, right? So they believe that they're fighting against capitalism, and capitalists don't like communists, right? However, what Marx predicted was that capitalism ultimately would die out, right? And so instead of fighting capitalists to put communism into those places, they could just let it die, right? And so because of that, Soviets could justify that they can peacefully coexist and ally with capitalist nations in the short term if it's something they needed to do, which of course is what we saw happen before and during World War II. And in fact, during the interwar period, they very much cooperated with Western capitalist nations, and in particular, they signed a non-aggression pact with Germany, with Hitler's Nazi Germany. Now, they did this because this allowed them to peacefully develop their industry during the 1930s, right? Germany did this, of course, to kind of prevent a two-front war, right? They wanted to take out the Western Front in France first, but then they would eventually, of course, invade the Soviet Union. There we go. They also would utilize non-state networks, so spies essentially, to covertly support communist revolutionaries in foreign countries, including the United States, with their hope to undermine capitalism and imperialism. So Marxist-Leninism is one of the major bedrocks of Soviet history and Soviet policy, but the other one, and probably the more important, and what they're saying specifically more important, is the life, the personality, and the desires of Joseph Stalin. So Joseph Stalin, the Man of Steel, takes over after Lenin's death in 1924. And a very quick biography of Stalin: he's born in 1878 in Georgia, which is just south of the Caucasus Mountains, which if we look here, we can see where Georgia is, right? So Georgia is on the edge of the Soviet Union, right? This Soviet Union at this point is the kind of stands here, and Russia, and then Georgia, and maybe Azerbaijan. I think Azerbaijan at this point, and Ukraine, and some of this area over here. Maybe Belarus. I think Belarus might have already been part of it this time. I can't guarantee that. But he's on the border of the Soviet Union, right? He's an ethnic minority, right? So for him to come to power in the Soviet Union is kind of the perfect example of the Soviet Union providing equal opportunity for all their ethnic minorities. His father was a very poor shoemaker, and he for a while considered going to the priesthood, but eventually dedicates himself to the overthrow of the Romanovs, which are the last dynasty that rules Russia, the main dynasty, frankly. And before 1917, he's repeatedly arrested and imprisoned for his revolutionary activities, much like Lenin. In fact, I believe Lenin is imprisoned in Germany, or he's sent to Germany, and then the Germans sent him back to cause trouble. It's great. Despite this, and despite some of his major contributions, right, he is an original member of the Bolshevik Party. He is a veteran of the Civil War that fought in 1920 and 1922, and he's an incredibly high-ranking Soviet official. He is not chosen to be Lenin's successor. Lenin, I believe, picks Leon Trotsky. But He is the head of the Communist Party, right? He's kind of one of the major heads. I don't know if they're saying he's actually in charge or he's just near the top. He used his position as head of the Communist Party to consolidate his own power and set his rivals against one another, right? And then, so there's always this like backdoor backstabbing going on whenever the communist leader dies in the Soviet Union. In 1928, he seizes control over the Soviet government. So 4 years after taking over, right? And he used the state propaganda that the Soviets had pretty much perfected at this point to promote himself as he is the Soviet Union, right? That's what he is telling his people, elevating himself to a godlike status. So in the 1930s, he mobilizes the populace to do two things: to continue to industrialize rapidly and to collectivize agriculture, which doing those two things at the same time is very dangerous, right? You're completely changing the economy, right, in one fell swoop. And this involved a lot of forced labor, right? Forcing the subjects of the Soviet Union to work for the government, right? But, hey, it's for the greater good. That also led to the arrest and murder and deportation of millions of Soviets, right? So arrest and murder, maybe not millions, but quite a lot of people. The deportation of millions of Soviets. And in particular in Ukraine, which is a breadbasket, right? It's a huge wheat producer. The collectivization there killed millions of people, mostly because the people there refused to collectivize in a lot of ways, and they kind of rebelled, but in small ways. But then instead of, what would happen is that the Soviet government would say, hey, we need the wheat from Ukraine over here, so to go over here, and then the Ukrainians would not have any wheat themselves. On top of that, Stalin is a very paranoid man. He believes that the capitalist nations were conspiring to crush the Soviet Union, which is probably true, right? Just from what we talked about already. And to solidify his own power, he orders a purge of his perceived enemies within the party, government, and military, which most of these people were not his enemies. They just were people who he thought might be enemies. He arrested and imprisoned 3.5 million people and executed 700,000 in the Great Terror, which is what this is called, right? So for a parallel, right, in the French Revolution, there was the Reign of Terror, where 16,000 people died or so. 700,000. He executed 700,000 people just because he was paranoid that people were trying to take over. 700,000 people. That's insane. And so Stalin's crimes really brought a negative light to what was supposed to be this utopia that was the Soviet Union, right? And it offered a pretty bad-looking future for those in the Soviet Union living under Stalin, especially when we see what happens when non-Soviet states are saved from the Nazis by the Soviets, right? And they just kind of stay there after the war. They occupy this territory in Eastern Europe. And they are going to not live a good life under Stalin. And in the post-World War world, Stalinism becomes one of the defining examples of one-party dictatorship. This is not communism in its raw form, right? This is communism brought under the control of Joseph Stalin, right? Stalin has made communism this dictatorship, but it's not necessarily a one-person dictatorship. One-party dictatorship, maybe. But one-person dictatorship is not necessarily what the image of neither Marx nor Lenin had in mind for the Soviet Union. And in fact serves as the inspiration for George Orwell's novel 1984, which I think we all assumed was going to be our novel. But Cat's Cradle ended up being phenomenal, so I'm glad that that's the book. Am I actually recording this time? That is a great question. Yeah, I think I am. All right, cool. So that's going to be it for this section. I actually think I like typing out the notes beforehand and then going through them like this. This might be a little quicker for the videos, so maybe I'll do that, keep doing this. But yeah, until the next one, thank you guys so much for watching.